For decades, Jimmy Savile was one of the most recognized faces in Britain, a television fixture, a tireless fundraiser, a man knighted for his service to the nation. When he died in October 2011, tributes poured in from across the establishment. Within a year, a far darker picture emerged. Hundreds of victims, abuse spanning 5 decades, and a question that still has no satisfying answer: how did so many people across British public life appear to know, yet nobody said anything? The trail leads back to a single investigation the BBC never allowed to air. The decision to investigate Jimmy Savile within the BBC began with a sense of urgency. In late 2011, Newsnight's editorial team responded to information from Surrey Police, launching an assignment to scrutinize not only Savile's alleged crimes, but also the BBC's own handling of complaints. Editor Peter Rippon approved the story, directing senior producer Emma Hawkins to gather survivor statements, police files, and internal records. The initial brief was clear: expose any institutional failings that might have shielded Savile from scrutiny. Momentum built quickly. By September 2011, the first editorial meeting set out a production schedule targeting early 2012 for broadcast. A draft script circulated on October 22, 2011, prompting producers to seek legal advice. The story was no longer just about Savile's actions. It now touched the BBC's reputation, legal risk, and the possibility of defamation claims. The legal team, led by BBC News solicitor David Blake, returned a memorandum on December 3, 2011. The memo warned of potential defamation risk and noted insufficient corroboration for some survivor statements. It recommended postponement until police investigations concluded, raising the first formal barrier. Internal emails from this period reveal a growing sense of caution. Correspondence between journalists Dan Johnson, Sarah Kemp, and senior editors stressed the need to be absolutely sure we have the facts. The legal memo's language was stark: high-risk defamation, incomplete evidence, and the specter of litigation. Editorial confidence began to waver. The legal team's advice, now on record, could not be ignored without exposing the BBC to significant liability. On January 8, 2012, a senior editorial meeting brought together the head of news, George Entwistle, and key Newsnight staff. Minutes from this meeting, later cited in the Pollard Review, record Entwistle's warning that the BBC must not appear to jump on the bandwagon before police findings were public. He advocated for a cautious approach, suggesting the story be softened or delayed. The legal perspective had become central to every decision, and the risk to the corporation's reputation was now weighed against the duty to report. Emma Hawkins continued to revise the script, seeking more verification and corroboration, but the pattern was set. Legal caution had moved from the margins to the heart of editorial decision-making. The investigation, once greenlit with urgency, now faced a slow tightening of institutional controls. Each new memo, each meeting, added another layer of hesitation, creating a climate where legal and reputational risk became the overriding concern. On 27 March 2012, the final decision landed. Peter Rippon, Newsnight's editor, issued a clear directive. The investigation into Jimmy Savile would not air. His email to the production team cited ongoing legal concerns, the unresolved police inquiry, and the risk of defamation. The language was precise, shelved pending further evidence, and the effect was immediate. Years of survivor testimony, months of internal reporting, and weeks of editorial debate were all suspended with a single veto. The internal email chain from that week captures a newsroom in quiet turmoil. Journalists who had gathered evidence, Dan Johnson, Sarah Kemp, and Emma Hawkins, expressed frustration and disbelief. Producers had been told to wait for the legal department's comfort, but found their work abruptly halted. Emma Hawkins's production notes, later quoted in the Pollard Review, record her disappointment. Another legal put-down. It feels like we are being told to stop asking questions. Rippon's authority was absolute in this moment. As Newsnight editor, he alone held the power to broadcast or bury the story. His decision, documented in the BBC's internal records, would soon become a central piece of evidence in the post-mortem inquiries. The BBC's legal team had shaped the boundaries of what could be reported, but Rippon's veto made the outcome final. Within months, the story that Newsnight had prepared was overtaken by events outside the BBC. When ITV aired its own investigation in October 2012, public outrage forced the BBC Trust to appoint Sir John Pollard to review the handling of the Newsnight file. The Pollard Review, published on 23 November 2012, examined the editorial process in detail. Its conclusion was stark. The decision to drop the story was flawed and influenced by reputational concerns rather than journalistic judgment. Pollard's assessment drew directly from the dated evidence. He cited the 27th March veto, the legal memos, and the internal emails as proof that institutional caution had overridden the duty to investigate. The report described a culture of risk aversion that left critical questions unanswered and allowed damaging silence to persist. The BBC's failure was not simply a matter of one editor's decision, but of a system that prioritized the corporation's image over the pursuit of truth. The aftermath of Rippon's veto did not end with the Newsnight team. It set a precedent for how major British institutions would be scrutinized in the years to come. The BBC's internal controls, legal anxieties, and reputational fears were laid bare for public examination. Pollard's findings echoed across other sectors, raising uncomfortable parallels and prompting a wave of external reviews. In the silence that followed, the consequences of institutional fear became impossible to ignore. At Stoke Mandeville Hospital, the volunteer records tell a story of access shaped less by scrutiny than by trust. Savile's file, recovered from the Buckinghamshire Healthcare Trust archives, lists him as a senior volunteer. The card grants unrestricted access, with no evidence of a background check or formal interview. This designation placed him outside the usual controls, even as the hospital's own policies required routine vetting for other volunteers. The Trust's Speaking Out inquiry later found that the HR archive contained no safeguarding paperwork for Savile, just the volunteer card and a handful of thank you notes from senior staff. The ledger at Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility, followed a different but equally permissive logic. Here, Savile's name appears in a separate charity guest column of the visitor book, distinct from the main register used for staff and regular visitors. This column, reserved for donors and celebrity patrons, did not require staff countersignatures or escort logs. The 2013 inquiry into Broadmoor's records showed that for years, Savile was able to move unaccompanied through secure wards. His visits logged only as guest, no escort required. The structure of the ledger effectively placed him beyond everyday monitoring, relying on his status as a trusted benefactor. Complaints about Savile's conduct at both hospitals were documented but rarely escalated. At Stoke Mandeville, a 2003 entry in the Trust's risk register notes a senior nurse's concern that Savile had been seen entering the spinal injuries unit alone after hours. The entry was not forwarded to the safeguarding board, which at the time focused solely on child protection. At Broadmoor, 3 adult safeguarding alerts between 2005 and 2008 referenced a male volunteer seen alone with female patients. Each was closed with the comment, "No evidence of misconduct," despite corroborating staff recollections. The complaints were recorded, but the procedural gap meant they never triggered a formal investigation. Trust managers, when interviewed in subsequent inquiries, often pointed to policy documents that left room for interpretation. At Stoke Mandeville, the reliance on goodwill for donors and celebrity volunteers meant that senior staff could override standard procedures. At Broadmoor, the volunteer and donor ledgers were maintained separately from the main visitor log, creating an administrative silo that shielded high-profile guests from routine checks. In both cases, the existence of parallel record-keeping systems allowed warnings to be sidelined or lost. The pattern was clear. The combination of honorary titles, donor status, and informal endorsements by senior staff created procedural loopholes. These loopholes were not unique to one hospital or one trust. Instead, they represented a repeatable pattern, systems that, by design or neglect, prioritized reputation and fundraising over safeguarding. The result was an environment in which Savile's presence was not only tolerated, but institutionalized, with oversight mechanisms that failed to match the risks presented by his access. The evidence from Stoke Mandeville and Broadmoor stands as a case study in systemic oversight failure. Volunteer cards, visitor ledgers, and soft recorded complaints reveal not just gaps in policy, but a culture that deferred to status and generosity. The consequence was a structure where institutional protection became routine, and silence was the default response to warning signs. A guest book from Ward 3 at Leeds General Infirmary, held at the City Archives, contains a single line dated 19th of September 1983 that reads, J. Savile. The signature sits among names of staff, patients, and visitors, a quiet entry in a routine log. Yet for one survivor, this date anchors their account of abuse to a specific moment and place. The book's existence and the match with survivor testimony illustrates how ordinary institutional records can become evidence if anyone is willing to look. In Leeds, records of Savile's visits are scattered and incomplete. Electronic visitor registers only start from 1995. Most paper logs from the 1970s and the 1980s were shredded after a decade, standard practice at the time. What remains is fragmentary, a handful of guest books, a few internal emails, and the recollections of staff. One such email, sent by a nurse to a ward manager in 1999, warned that Savile often roamed the pediatric ward after hours without an escort. The message was filed, but not escalated. No formal response was recorded. The warning faded into the background noise of daily operations. The Leeds Trust's internal review, published in 2014, found that the complaints system was fragmented. Concerns about Savile's conduct were often rooted to the patient experience team, not the safeguarding board. Written grievances, like the one filed by a ward clerk in 2001, ended up in the archive as non-clinical correspondence. This administrative silo allowed patterns of behavior to slip through the cracks, unaddressed and uninvestigated. National policy was evolving, but inconsistently applied. In 1998, NHS England issued new guidance recommending criminal background checks, then known as CRB and later DBS, for any volunteer with unsupervised patient contact. But the guidance was advisory, not mandatory. Leeds introduced a formal DBS requirement for new volunteers in 2003, yet existing volunteers, including Savile, were exempted under a grandfather clause. The clause allowed all prior volunteers to continue without retrospective vetting. As a result, Savile's access remained unchallenged. His badge and keycard, issued years earlier, were never recalled. The 1999 staff email and the 2001 grievance reveal that frontline staff were uneasy, but the system offered no clear pathway for escalation. National guidance was slow to filter down, and local policy left critical gaps. The Leeds Review identified 71 alleged victims, many of whom described incidents that occurred after the 1998 guidance. The gap between policy intent and practical enforcement became a matter of record, not conjecture. For Leeds, the story is not only about what was missed, but about how institutional processes, guest books, emails, and vetting policies created a patchwork of accountability. Each step in the chain depended on someone choosing to act, and on a system designed to listen. Where the chain broke, silence prevailed. The cracks in policy and practice were not unique to Leeds, but part of a national pattern that allowed risk to become routine. In the absence of robust, enforced safeguards, institutional deference and administrative inertia left space for abuse to go unchecked. In 1985, the guest list for the Royal Charity Gala at the Royal Albert Hall included Jimmy Savile's name among the patrons. The invitation, printed on official stationery, placed him alongside members of the royal family and senior political figures. Such lists were not merely ceremonial, they confirmed Savile's standing at the highest levels of British society. His presence at these events was not incidental. He was regularly described as a patron or honored guest, an endorsement that carried weight across public life. Official recognition did not stop at gala invitations. A Cabinet Office memorandum dated March 2010, titled Honours, Screening of Candidates, advised the Honours Secretariat to apply minimal scrutiny to nominees already holding royal patronage or high-profile charitable appointments. The memo referenced Savile by name, citing his long-standing charitable service as grounds to proceed with his CBE nomination without the usual checks. This language, matter-of-fact and bureaucratic, reveals how established status could override ordinary due diligence. For those within the system, these honors and invitations were more than gestures. They signaled acceptance, trust, and an implicit guarantee of character. The effect was to place Savile in a category apart, one where routine scrutiny was seen as unnecessary, even inappropriate. The official voice of the establishment found in these documents became a shield, making questions about Savile's conduct not just unlikely, but institutionally discouraged. Inside the communications offices of major British institutions, the language of praise became policy. A 2008 BBC internal memo, circulated by the Communications Department, described Jimmy Savile as the most successful fundraiser in the organization's history. The note was drafted for a press release, but it included a margin warning that said, "Caution, any hint of misconduct could erode donor confidence," and it recommended strict internal control of media queries. This phrasing was not unique. At Leeds General Infirmary, 2005 correspondence between the charity office and the chief executive advised that publicity around Jimmy's generosity must be protected and that any negative press could jeopardize future donations. These documents reveal how institutional messaging was carefully managed. Public statements focused on Savile's fundraising totals and his role as a national treasure. Internally, however, staff were instructed to avoid discussions that might raise questions about his conduct. Risk avoidance became part of the communications strategy. A note from a 1998 Manchester regional meeting discussing a hospital fundraiser reads that the subject was to be investigated but not escalated externally, and that staff should maintain a positive profile. Such memos did more than shape public perception. They created a buffer, insulating Savile from scrutiny and discouraging staff from raising concerns. Praise was not just a reward for generosity, it became a shield, converting institutional gratitude into inertia. The internal logic was clear: reputational risk outweighed uncomfortable truths. In this climate, silence was not accidental. It was codified, repeated, and enforced by those responsible for the organization's public image. Even now, official inquiries count over 450 victims, yet the mechanisms that shielded Savile persist in countless institutions. Silence, deference, and fear of reputational harm remain formidable barriers to accountability. As new scandals emerge across sectors, the lesson is clear. Without active vigilance and transparency, history does not just repeat, it endures. The responsibility to speak out belongs to all, not just to the few. Share your thoughts below.